Hi, I am Aleph. Please donate so I can get a PhD in genetics and leave your counter-arguments in the comments. Start by asking yourself the following question. What kind of evidence would convince you that there is a genetic component to the race gaps in IQ? Eric Turkheimer is a professor of psychology at the University of Virginia and one of the world's foremost experts on intelligence and someone who believes that race IQ gaps are environmental in nature. This is the kind of evidence that would convince him.
Hypothetically, what type of evidence, if you could imagine it, would tell us that IQ differences between races are specifically because of race? Is that even a possibility?
I mean, here's the way I think that could turn out to be true. I mean, and my point is that this is very unlikely to happen. If we someday, what doesn't exist, even though IQ is heritable, like everything about people is heritable, there are no, in the normal range, aside from Down syndrome and things like that, there in the normal range, the difference between your IQ and mine, there are no known genetic mechanisms that determine your IQ. That, oh, well, okay, David has genes X, Y, and Z, and Eric has genes A, B, and C, and we know that it's always true that people with X, Y, Z genes have higher IQs than A, B, C genes, and we, especially if we ever understood the mechanism, because you can see, here's what X, Y, Z genes do to your brain and enhance the neurons, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and because of that, people with those genes are smarter pretty much all the time, not contingent on anything else. If that were true, well, then you could find a group of people that had those genes and a group of people that didn't have those genes and say, well, the difference between those groups seems like it's caused by those genes. And that might apply to American blacks and whites, and it might not, but it's going to explain the difference between some groups that have them and groups that don't have them.
So this is the kind of evidence that would convince Eric Turkheimer that there are genetic components to the race and IQ gap. I certainly know what would convince me that there is no genetic component to the race and IQ gaps. It would be just the opposite of what Eric Turkheimer described. If we found those genes he mentions, and it turned out that the proportion of people of all races that had them was exactly the same, that would be pretty persuasive evidence that I am wrong. I think I would change my mind at that point. As of 2022, scientists have found thousands of genetic variants associated with educational attainment, a close proxy for IQ, in what are known as Genome-Wide association studies. As of now, we do not understand the causal mechanisms these genetic variants use to affect IQ. All we know is that they cause you to have a higher IQ somehow. Most of these genome-wide association studies have been done in racially homogeneous samples for good methodological reasons. We can summarize how many of these genetic variants an individual has with a polygenic score. In general, people who have higher polygenic scores will tend to have higher IQs than people with lower polygenic scores, regardless of race. The frequency of these genetic variants in a human population can also be summarized in a polygenic score. In general, we would expect populations with higher polygenic scores to have higher IQs than populations with lower polygenic scores, even if we are not talking about race. We could be talking about people who have a PhD compared to people who only have a BA, or people who like classical music compared to people who like rock. We would expect this association to hold, even if we control for socioeconomic status and other confounding variables. The following table is from a 2015 study by David Piffer published in the journal Intelligence. It summarizes the distribution of about a dozen genetic variants associated with educational attainment among populations of different races. As you can see, the polygenic scores are quite different. As you can see in the following correlation, these polygenic scores correspond tightly to observed phenotypic differences in IQ. Now, I know David Piffer has said objectionable things on Twitter. But to say that this means that these numbers are wrong is an ad hominem fallacy. I should also say that some people have accused the journal Intelligence of publishing quote-unquote racist pseudoscience. However, I have asked for examples of articles published on Intelligence whose methodology is so flawed that they qualify as pseudoscience, but have not been given any. I can certainly say That intelligence has published facts that appear to be invidious and politically inconvenient, but that does not make them pseudoscience. In any case, you do not need to believe David Piffer or the journal Intelligence. These numbers beginning in RS are the reference numbers for the genetic variants. You can take these numbers and go to the Geography of Genetic Variants browser of the University of Chicago or the Genome Aggregation database of the Broad Institute of MIT and Harvard and check their distributions yourself. Piffer also replicated these results in a 2019 paper published in the journal Psych using more than 2,000 genetic variants. This bar chart summarizes the results. Again, you do not need to trust Piffer or the journal Psych on this. You can check the results yourself using the databases I provided. The pattern is quite clear. East Asian populations have the highest polygenic scores, followed by white populations, followed by brown populations, followed by black populations. Now I want to bring your attention to this set of regressions from the same study, where the dependent variable is a country's IQ. Notice that while environmental factors, like the country's Human Development Index, average protein consumption, and child mortality, undoubtedly have an effect, in each case the coefficient on the polygenic scores remains statistically significant. Discussion of these polygenic scores has already entered the mainstream psychological literature, as can be seen in this article by Russell T. Warren published in 2021 in the American Journal of Psychology. This methodology has also been used to argue that differences in average IQs between Jews, like myself, and Gentiles have a genetic component to them, as can be seen in this article published in Evolutionary Behavioral Sciences. I will also point you to the fact that Kevin A. Bird has published work on the polygenic scores in the American Journal of Physical Anthropology. As you can see, he concluded that there is no support for the hereditarian hypothesis of the black-white achievement gap using polygenic scores and tests for divergent selection. There are several interesting things about this paper. The first, and most striking of which, is that it does not deny the existence of differences in the polygenic scores. This is pretty strong evidence that this cannot be gainsaid at this point. What the article does deny is that there is evidence that these differences arose due to natural selection. Basically, there are three different ways in which genetic differences between populations can originate: a founder effect, genetic drift, and natural selection. This paper basically argues these differences did not arise through natural selection. But even if you grant that it happened due to a founding effect and genetic drift, what matters from the hereditarian perspective is merely that the differences are there at all. The paper goes on to estimate the percentage of the gap caused by genes, giving a low estimate, but still, it did not argue that 100% of the gap is environmental. At this point then, it is safe to say that the mainstream scientific literature on racial differences in polygenic scores for educational attainment already assumes that there is both a genetic and an environmental component to race IQ gaps. The only contention at this point then is the relative importance of these factors, whether one or another accounts for 5%, 50%, or 95% of the gap. However, it is safe to say at this point, based on the evidence from the polygenic scores and contemporary discussion of it in the mainstream scientific literature, that the genetic contribution to the race IQ gaps is not 0%. It will not be long before we understand the mechanisms that these genetic variants use to influence someone's IQ. Indeed, it will probably happen within Eric Turkheimer's lifetime. I look forward to see what he has to say about this data and what he will have to say once those mechanisms he speaks about are discovered. Thanks for listening. See you in the next video.